It is my honor and privilege to introduce the chairman of the Committee on Urban Development, Housing and Resettlement, Senate of the Republic of the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Senator Ferdinand Bongbong R. Marcos Jr.
Well, thank you again for asking me to come and be with you at this your monthly meeting to give you some updates on the latest pending bills, especially this one creating the Department of Housing. It is, if you will recall, I had the opportunity in Macau to speak before you at your first international convention. And at that forum, I presented to you the enormous challenges that we had before us, as well as the opportunities for improving housing in the Philippines, articulating to you the huge gap between the demand and supply. We identified between us, one, the inability of poor households to pay the cost of housing, two, lack of resources on the part of government, which is traditionally seen to be the provider of housing, and thirdly, the lack of incentives for the private sector to be part of the effort to improve the housing situation in the Philippines. In Macau last year, we came to the conclusion that the perceived poor performance of demand housing in the Philippines needed further innovative ideas if we are to stem the tide of what is considered as the fairly sad state of affairs in housing in the Philippines. After enjoining you to bring, if you remember at the very end of my talk, I asked you to make it known, to bring to the attention of all and make housing, especially socialized housing, a centerpiece of government policy. And after all the noise and drum beating done to get the attention of our policymakers, it looks like we are starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to this. This is the #1 priority, and in the latest LEDAC meeting, it was included as a priority legislation. So, my friends in the housing sector, today is a good opportunity for me to update you on what has transpired since our last meeting. There have been 3 proposed versions in the Senate put forward by our resigned colleague, Senator Subiri, also one by Senator Frank Dillon, and another by Senate Pro Tem Senator Jinggoy Estrada. Because of the rapid urbanization of the Philippines, more of our poor population are forced to move from the rural areas to settle in the cities in the hope of finding a better life and enjoying better amenities. In the cities, however, most of the time they end up staying in low-income communities that abound in the metropolitan areas where the living conditions remain far from ideal and more often are actually miserable. It is no wonder that our urban areas continue to display glaring gaps between the wealthy enclaves and the poor communities. There are more impoverished communities in our cities whose living conditions cannot be upgraded because of unaffordable and soaring urban land costs, made more burdensome by the high cost of basic home utilities. This is something that keeps coming up over and over again in our discussions in committee. If you will recall, almost 4 decades ago, a small core group at the Development Academy of the Philippines evolved into the Task Force on Human Settlements. With the help of environmental planners from the then Institute of Planning, the task force began organizing a comprehensive framework for planning and developing Philippine human settlements, with considerations for availability of basic services, especially for the poorest of the poor. Eventually, this task force became the nucleus of what was to be known as the Ministry of Human Settlements, which was tasked to come up with a total holistic approach to achieve human security for all Filipinos. That is why it was a Ministry of Human Settlements, not just housing. At that time, the human settlements identified 11 basic needs for Filipinos that had to be consistently addressed in the short, medium, and long term. Those 11 items were water, electricity, clothing, livelihood, health, education, culture, technology, ecological balance, sports and recreation, shelter, and mobility. So you can see that immediately once we change in principle our thinking from merely building structures on land and building and bringing alive communities, immediately the entire problem cuts across the whole of the different social strata and the different sectors. In addition, some of the former subsidiaries or affiliates of human settlements were placed under HUDC, which then became headed by a chairman and given a cabinet rank. EO 90 of December 1786 placed the HUDC as the coordinating body for the government, housing or shelter agencies, including the HLURB as an attached body of the HUDC. The HLURB took on integrated roles of town planning, assistance to local government units, real estate management, and regulation altogether, and including the adjudication of cases involving buyers in subdivisions and condominiums. The HUDC, as then established, was limited to policy making and was not involved in the implementation of HLURB's mandates. Thus, in order to address this observed weakness, there emerged a perceived need to reorganize the housing or shelter agencies, resulting in the proposal to merge the functions of the HLURB with HUDC under one secretary. This led to the present proposals to create the Department of Housing and Urban Development and reconstituting and renaming HLURB into an independent and more powerful adjudicatory commission. In this evolution, it was provided in the proposed DHUD, or Department of Housing and Urban Development, DHUD bill, that the regulatory function of housing and urban development shall be vested with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the adjudicatory function be vested on a separate and independent Housing and Urban Development Commission. The other version, placing and integrating under one roof all the functions under the proposed Department of Housing. These are the different formulae which we are presently studying, of which we will have to decide which final form will be reported out by the committee. As you can see, the further this discussion comes to, again, we come to this, as I said, more than once at each hearing and at every discussion, that when we begin to look deeply into what is really required of us, it is communities. Again, not simply structures, but communities. And once we talk of communities, then we have to look into so many other sectors. And that is why it is not a simple matter to put together a new department which will be able to address all the different sectors that are necessary to be addressed if we are going to make a success of this effort. Therefore, the proposed Department of Housing and Urban Development, hereinafter referred to as the Department or DHUD, by merging the Housing and Urban Development Coordinating Council and the Housing and Land Use Regulatory Board, shall act as the primary national government entity responsible for the management of housing and urban development. Your President was with us when we began the discussions on what to do with the present HLURB. If we are to reform it into a commission, how do we keep its political, or rather its independence or its objectivity away from political forces? At the same time, we need to allow the department and the secretary of the new department to step in if there are egregious mistakes, egregious contracts that need to be investigated. This is the fine line which we are now trying to define, which our new Department of Housing is going to have to work with. In this connection, I understand that CREBA has some concern, and again, President Janice brought it up earlier, about increased concern about increasing costs of getting development permits for the many real estate projects of your members all over the nation. We have to be diplomatic in this regard because we need the local government to come and help us in all that we are doing. So perhaps if we show them a better way, a more efficient way, with less room to maneuver or less curricular activities or quote-unquote understandings, then perhaps we will be able to present a much better organization. I will be accused and I will plead guilty to being biased. But in the consideration of the proposed DHUD creation, I would like to revisit and reconsider what the Ministry of Human Settlement Programs had hoped to achieve for our people then, and how it applies to us now, especially the marginalized and less privileged. The Ministry of Human Settlements Programs envisioned sustainable communities with affordable and accessible shelter, plus the minimal basic human security services and utilities needed to live decently amid livelihood opportunities such as jobs and micro and small enterprises. We in the Senate Committee on Urban Planning and Housing and our counterpart in the lower house look forward to the continued active and proactive participation of the private sector, especially of CREBA, in the creation of the activation of the new department. Because housing development is principally a private sector, must principally be a private sector-led economic enterprise, with the national government and the local government as your dynamic partners in ensuring the accelerated growth of the housing industry and the optimum development of our urban communities. And this is the main difference now between the context in which we operate than which operated in the time of the Ministry of Human Settlements. At that time, the Ministry of Human Settlements was still seen as the main provider of socialized and low-cost housing. And it was and the private sector was looked upon to be the provider for middle-class and upper-income housing. However, now, since the policy although the policy has changed as to giving priority to housing, that it has not changed so much, and as to come back to the original concept that government still be the provider. So we are going to move from the technical working group. It is now, we are approaching the end of August. The technical working group will no doubt be meeting all the way through September. And I am taking the unusual step of actually being part of the technical working group. Usually what happens is the senator, the chairman of the committee will put together all the information, and the technical working group will hammer out the details. But it is such an important, we have to get this right the first time. So it is so important that we understand exactly what the problem is, and that we decide clearly what our solutions will be and how we will implement those solutions. So as a schedule, I will put my neck on the line here, and I will say that by the end of October, we will have reported out. We will have reported out of committee the final version of the Senate bill creating the Department of Housing. I am in constant contact and consultation with my counterpart in the House of Representatives, the chairman of the Housing, who is one of your members. RGV is also very enthusiastic and has been working very hard. And as I said, we are committed and determined to get this out as soon as possible. I do not want to commit everybody else. I can only commit myself and my committee. Baka yung Pasko natin, we will be celebrating it already in the Department of Housing. So, the chairman of HUD-C, the vice president also agrees. The president also agrees. So we should not allow ourselves to lose this opportunity where everyone is on board and agreeing and pushing forward for the Department of Housing. So, as they say, strike while the iron is hot. That is what we are trying to do. And let us hope that come Christmas time, again, we will be celebrating the creation of the Department of Housing. So thank you very much.